Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, first of all, to people joining us online. I think there are about 30 people currently, and the numbers will be growing because everyone tends to zoom in at the last moment. And welcome to everybody in the room. My name is Fiona Johnson. I'm a non-executive director of the Evidence Quarter. Been involved in it since the outset in 2020. So I'm delighted to be here to welcome you all. And to the series, our series of Better Evidence, Better Government. This is the fourth. I think they've all been hybrid and they've been hugely successful so far. And I'm sure this evening will be no exception. I've got to do a few little housekeeping announcements. If there's a fire alarm, it's real. So please follow Frankie. You can't miss her. If you haven't met her before, she's in bright green down there. She'll lead everyone to a muster point in St. James's Park, which could be a bit spooky. There are toilets at the back through those double doors. If you haven't done so already, could you put your phones onto silent? And after the presentations, there will be an opportunity for discussion and questions at the end. Those of you who are online, if you could post your questions into the chat, a friendly proxy will ask them to the panelists. And if you're here in the room and you want to speak, put your hand up, and Frankie will bring a square roving mic, which looks like a great big dice. And please do use it, because otherwise your colleagues online won't be able to hear you, and anybody with hearing loss won't be able to take advantage of the amplification. So that's the housekeeping. Just for those of you who haven't been here before, a very brief introduction to the Evidence Quarter. Its whole purpose is to bring together people from leading evidence organisations, first and foremost, to start with, to share a space and all the opportunities for collaboration and discussion that come from physical proximity, to increase collaboration and to tackle joint challenges. It's much, much more than an office space. It's an opportunity to share ideas, discuss methodologies, work out how you're going to wrestle that really knotty research challenge to the ground, and also to provide mutual support, a bit of mentoring, all those kinds of things. So it's a really great community of research, policy and evaluation. And events like these give us the opportunity to share what we're learning, exchange ideas, and generally network and get to know each other. So we want to create opportunities for people who value using evidence. And I'm going to insert a little bit there because I work in research communications. So for me, my passion is not just evidence, but getting that evidence out there. For me, evidence that isn't disseminated barely deserves the name. You might as well call it a file. So I'm very excited about the Evidence Quarter's ambition to share research and to share ways of communicating the evidence that they found, both to government in the interests of better policy making, and to each other and to wider audiences. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Bobby Duffy, Director of the Policy Institute at King's, who'll tell you about this evening's event and our panellists.
Thanks so much, Fiona. And brilliant to be here. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and I guess my other role that's relevant here is I'm Chair of the Campaign for Social Science, which is part of the Academy of Social Science. So as you heard, brilliant to add my welcome to the latest in this series of top speakers from government, academia, and the evidence community more generally. And I think the objectives here are to raise the profile of evidence informing policy and practice for people, but also I think to learn the lessons about how to make it work. And I think that's the thing that I've taken from my attendance at 2 or 3 of the other events that we've had so far, is we actually learned a lot about what works and what doesn't in that evidence use and dissemination point. And that's basically the 2 core objectives of my 2 main organisations. Policy Institute is all about how do you translate evidence into policy. The Campaign for Social Science is how do we make the case that that's what good social science does. It actually influences outcomes more broadly. And we've had brilliant speakers in the series so far. We've had David Halpern, Lord O'Donnell, Professor Brooke Rogers from King's, and they've all been great, but I'm particularly looking forward to this one with Professor of Economics and Behavioural Science at Warwick, Andrew Oswald, which is great, and Nancy Hay, who's CEO of Works Wellbeing. And I've got a personal particular interest in this. I did a short secondment at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. We think, I don't know, Nancy knows better than me, around 2000, that sort of time. And it was on life satisfaction, the link between life satisfaction and happiness and trust in other people, and a bit but part of a bigger study about the importance of life satisfaction in government policy. And I did more or less just steal all Andrew's work and put it in this report, which was really, really useful. So very highly cited, as it says in my notes, including by me very often. So thank you for that, Andrew. So really looking forward to what will be a brilliant discussion. And over to Nancy to tell us more.
Thank you so much. This is my opportunity to ask one of our advisory panel members some questions rather than him asking me questions, which is a joy. I am the director of the Works Centre for Wellbeing. Our job is to find, share and grow evidence about what organisations in government, business and charities can do to improve wellbeing. Wellbeing is how we're doing as individuals, communities and as a nation, and how sustainable that is for the future. So it's a big ask. All of us have a role to play. I got into this question and the what works question because I was trying to do, I was working on constitutional reform and on the democratic systems, and I had to do a cost benefit analysis of changes to the electoral system for a business case to the Treasury. And I could put the costs to these changes really clearly on my impact assessment, but I could not put the benefits of democracy on my business case to the Treasury. Now, the Treasury actually just gave us the money, didn't question it, which is unheard of, which shows that this is stuff that we do in social policy making all the time, and we do care about it, but we couldn't put a number on this and we couldn't care about it. And that's what got me into this question quite a long lot of jobs later. So we're going to talk a little bit now about misery. Last week we were talking about hope, and so we're going to talk about misery and social trust and democracy. And Andrew's going to talk for about sort of 20 minutes, which is a talk I really enjoy. And then I'll ask him some questions. We'll have some opportunity for questions from the floor as well, if I let the mic go, and some online as well. So we'll try and hopefully get a lot of questions about emotions and democracy over the next hour.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. How kind of you to invite me. This is a man called Peter Turchin. He's a distinguished scientist, a kind of mathematical biologist or zoologist who works in the US and also in Vienna. And he's interested in cycles in the animal kingdom, and eventually became interested also in whether he could use the same sorts of modeling methods, predictive methods for cycles of a kind in human society. In Nature and in a number of other publications, a long time before the year 2020, he predicted that in that year, in 2020, the US would be subject to a kind of political revolution. It was about 8 years in advance. And the modeling that underlies that is not at all foolish. It bears in mind variables like inequality, a kind of youth bulge in the population. And he thinks that something he calls the overproduction of elites really matters, which you might think of as you're producing too many people with university degrees who have aspirations that can't all be satisfied. And that is dangerous for the stability of a democracy. Anyway, he was wrong, of course, in 2020, but only by 6 days, as I imagine you know. And I suppose that even if you're young in this room, this has made a huge impression on you. If you're my kind of age, it's scarcely credible, actually, and I'll come back to that. There's a little bit of a lag on this clicker. And that's definitely what I call a lag. I guess. Turchin very kindly sent me this graph, and I think it's worth knowing about. This is 5 or 6 of the rich countries, and you may not be able to see from the back, but this is the year 2010, this is 1950. So we see the ups and downs of demonstrations against governments. But around the year 2010, you see there's a kind of concerted spike up. These are the USA, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Spain, where he could code up the data. So there's clearly some common element going on across all these, presumably quite important democracies. And his modeling is trying to understand that and predict the future from it. If you go to William Hill, I confess I've got a William Hill account. I hope you don't think too ill of me for having a betting account. Mainly, I just use it. I'd recommend it to anyone, not for betting, which is disastrous because of the spreads, but you can look at all kinds of extremely interesting probabilities for events. And I take those seriously. There's a lot of evidence that economists should, because this is really the weight of international money on one side against another. If you put £1 on Trump to win at the moment, you will get £1.50 profit back, plus your pound. He is the leading candidate, well ahead of Biden, and they're both miles ahead of anybody else. My instinct, quite honestly, is that we are going to see a Trump election, although there's still a way to go. So what's happening in US society? I'm not sure if you can read this screen, but I'm sure you get the idea that very extreme emotions are involved, highly polarized emotions, certainly compared to when I was a young man going to and simply visiting. I lived in the US for a number of years. If you can't read this lady's T-shirt, it says, "Talking to you reminds me to clean my gun." And just in case the sentiment isn't sharp enough, the word gun is underlined. This is really what's happening inside the United States. I'm going to take you through data. I've got a hand in one of them. Data in 2 articles from the American Journal of Public Health that try to measure what you might call mental health, and in particular misery and extreme mental distress in the US. We'll look at the extremes and also at measures closer to the average. The first kind of evidence is with Blanchflower at Dartmouth. I won't tell you about the data except to mention we've got about 8 million randomly sampled people. The data spread over about 30 years. And we thought it would be especially interesting to look at the question because it's been asked in a consistent way for 3 decades of random samples, large random samples of Americans. You can imagine to a kind of statistician like me, that's particularly attractive because in principle, we have exactly the same reading every year over a long period. We'll come back to the interpretation of the words and so on. For how many days during the past 30 days was your mental health not good? Now, I won't ask you how you would answer that, but you might like to think. In general, in my life, I would have said 0. How many days during the past 30 was your mental health not good? There was a kind of low point that I won't be describing to you in detail in the middle of my life compared to a particular life event. And about a month ago, I contracted COVID for the second time, 2023 COVID. So I'm still not quite 100%, but even during the COVID episode, I don't think I would have ticked anything other than 0, even though if you've had this year's COVID, it makes you feel a bit low. Blanchflower and I thought, let's look at the people who say every day of my life. Every day of my life, every day of the last 30, that's been a day of bad mental health. This is clearly an extremely striking measure. Of course, we didn't know how the data would come out, but I suppose that we were interested in extreme misery. That would be a fair description, I think. So I'm going to show you a time series graph, ladies and gentlemen, over about 30 years, trying to measure extreme mental distress in the United States of America. I remind you that's an exceptionally important country for all kinds of reasons, and that generally our country follows the US in most of its trends 10 years, 20 years later. So this is what the graph looks like. You won't be able to see the axes terribly well unless you're close. That's about 4.5%. That's about 3%. The red line is females. And although extreme mental distress doesn't quite double for men and women, doesn't quite double through time, you can see a very powerful incline. Here we stopped the data at 2019 because we were writing up the paper then. But in fact, it was quite a good idea, even ex post, to avoid 2020, because of course we were plunged into a pandemic. You see, there's a powerful secular trend in the data of the United States, extreme misery over three decades. Now I'm going to show you what happens when you cut the data into different segments, because not all of America's citizens have experienced the same thing. And I'd like you in particular to look at a light blue line, or mid blue line anyway, that's about to show up. And here it is. Now these are midlife people. It's the big 20-year interval in the middle of our lives. And the light blue line is white Americans with what you might call loosely low education. To be a bit more precise, this is Americans with no college degree. So it's not entirely accurate to say low skill, but these are not university graduates. Here, in 1993, 5% of those Americans, 1 in 20, suffered extreme mental distress on this 30 out of 30 measure. That has more than doubled to about 11.5%. I've given you a slightly evocative picture of a white American female worker. The other lines haven't demonstrated nearly as much incline, although they have a bit. And my honest opinion is that this is certainly partly why Mr. Trump was elected. Now, why is that happening? I'll tell you for 30 seconds a story of a postman. In 1983, I went to America for the first time. It was very exciting. I was at Oxford at the time. I'm afraid I probably thought rather highly of myself. Going to meet a lot of Princeton economists certainly wised me up a bit about how astoundingly clever other people were around the world. My wife and I lived on campus, and one day I got chatting to my postman, and he said to me, Andrew, we got quite friendly, Andrew, this weekend I'm going to my summer house. And I thought, I don't mean to belittle postmen at all. One of my best friends at the moment is a postman. But I thought, wow, in this country that is so rich, this is 1983, right? That even a postman has a summer house. And there's a very real sense in which that has changed for white, relatively low-skilled Americans. I tell you that story just as an example. There's a sense of bitterness. There's a sense of my parents had a great life. They were always moving up. My grandparents had an amazing life. You know, maybe they came from another country, maybe they didn't. And that underlying sense of resentment, it has helped Mr. Trump to be elected, and I think will again. Now, those are for really extreme distress. I'm just going to do this quickly. This is the work of Michael Daly, a talented Irish researcher. And if you take a wider, a more lenient notion of extreme misery, everything's still going, I'm afraid, in the wrong direction. There are lots of other troubling markers. I think inequality of wealth in the US is a particularly important one. Now, most people in this room have probably sat through data on inequality of wealth and inequality of income and all of the rest. Generally, what happens is people say things like the top 1% own 18% of the country, or the top 1% earn this kind of money, and so on. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I think if we're trying to understand how robust democracy is going to be for the rest of our lives, we might want to think the other way up. So we could look at the bottom 50% of Americans. The bottom 50% of Americans, that's half the voters. They own 1% of the wealth of the United States. And I think we have to ask ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, I certainly ask myself, could that be a stable feature of a democracy? Could it really persist over a long period? Our country is rather different. Of course, the bottom 50% don't do well by definition, but they have about 15, 17% of the wealth on most measures. What else might be a concern for democracy? If you're far at the back, you may not be able to see. This is lots of automatic weapons. When I was in New Jersey in 1983 with my young family, we soon realized that fairly close to the shredded wheat were lots of automatic weapons. And it was just part of the supermarket that we went to. For a Brit like me, I've never handled a rifle. Don't think I've ever handled a pistol. Of course, that made quite an impression. Very sadly, what are called active shooter incidents have a very strong upward growth in the United States of America. This is over 20 years. You see far, far more than a doubling. The population of the US hasn't moved a great deal in 20 years. So those guns are being put to all kinds of uses, and not all of the uses are ones we might be happy about. There are substantially more firearms than there are citizens of the United States. Now, how about if we go on to trust, and we have one or two trust experts in the audience. This is the decline of trust, dated from about 1958. In 1958, 3/4 of Americans trusted their government in Washington, 3/4. In a relatively small number of decades, I'm sorry to tell you, that's now down to 1 person in 5, about 20%. Trust in others has also collapsed, if that's not too strong a word. Let's be more balanced and say declined substantially. Trust in others, not just in politicians. You might think that trust in others is a kind of glue that might help a happy society stick together in some sense. And this is not just an American phenomenon. If we go back to 1944 in our country, you would think we had other things to do in 1944, if you think about it, but a third of Brits thought that British politicians were out for themselves, 1/3. And now I'm afraid 2/3 do. Again, is that a sustainable feature of democracy, especially given the trends are continuing to go in this direction? Now, feelings lead to actions, of course. I've worked on various papers, so have many distinguished researchers around the world. We know that your feeling about your income was a strong predictor of Brexit. How you felt about your income was a much better predictor of Brexit than your actual income. I'm just going to say that again because we thought that was so remarkable. How you felt about your income, not the number of pound notes, was a much better predictor of how you voted on the Brexit issue. So that although people talked about migration, they talked about getting their country back, they talked about the NHS, there's plenty of reason to believe that a kind of deep resentment about their lives drove a great deal of that voting. They were given a chance to vote against something and they were grumpy. I think that's what comes out in part of the data. Thanks to Dinev and colleagues, we know that unhappiness, if you look at the data, was a strong predictor of voting for Trump and more generally populist voting in other countries. More broadly, we're going to have to cope with this in the rest of our life, I'm afraid. Of course, temperature is rising, carbon dioxide is rising. You may not know these graphs. This is due to young colleagues I'm working with in Singapore, Tang, Mahanti, and Pauthavi. This is disasters through time. That's 1960. That is 2020. Of course, there's plenty of jagged movements in that time series. But that's another stressor to all kinds of societies, certainly including, I'm afraid, democracies. You may not know that infectious diseases also go in the same direction. I'm sorry to be listing all this bad stuff. You know, I'm supposed to be an expert on happiness. Somehow or other, I have strayed into what we would call the negative quadrant in mathematics. This doesn't even mention 2020. The data stop at 2010. Of course, if we included 2020, all sorts of large vertical bars would appear. Price inflation, and we should bear in mind that human beings have very asymmetric feelings about their income changes. If you get richer, we know that you feel a little bit happier. If you get less rich, if money is, as it were, taken away from you or disappears, it really hurts. So this is a highly concave function in my jargon, or just to put it differently, very probably kinked, so that going down hurts far, far more than going up is nice. And that's a problem at the moment, as you'll know, in our country and many other countries. There's many signs of this this sort of tendency, these kinds of pressures in many countries. Let me start to draw to a close because I'm interested to make it a discussion. I'm sorry to tell you that I think democracy faces a real difficulty. I imagine it'll be okay in my country until I die. But yeah, we are going through a bad phase. And regrettably, my view is it's going to get worse. I hope I'm wrong. Extreme dissatisfaction among some of our citizens, remarkable decline, remarkable in faith in politicians. How can you have a democracy functioning smoothly if there's no trust in politicians? Very difficult. Inequalities, is getting remarkable. People talk about billionaires now a great deal. When I was young, people aspired to be a millionaire. Climate change, that's going to upset an awful lot of countries, awful lot of citizens, and worsen pressures. We're likely to have more pandemics, I'm terribly sorry to tell you. With luck, not in my lifetime, if that is not an unfair thing to say, but the very best of luck to the younger people in the room. And inflation, of course, is a sign of an economy that, from my point of view, is out of equilibrium. The oven is running too hot, and we're not quite sure how to turn the temperature down. Now, non-democracies also face nearly all of these problems, but Mr. Putin, of course, is in a different position and can more or less ban people from talking about a lot of this stuff. Many of us have worried about the state of Britain in 2023 and over the last decade, but it's useful, I think, to get things in perspective and remember that we are exceptionally lucky, in my opinion, and also in the data to live in the UK. We have to ask ourselves, are patterns like the ones I've shown you feasibly consistent with the kind of democracy that I've grown up with and anyone older in the room has grown up with? Are they really consistent with that? Just to remind you, this drop in trust in politicians in the USA, here's the drop in trust in politicians in Great Britain. Extreme dissatisfaction has shown up in some of our citizens. That I think that's clear over Brexit, very clear over the forces that led to Trump. You see it in our kinds of data through time. As a young economist, that was the college that I went to, I was taught very fiercely, would not be an unfair word, you do not study feelings, Andrew. All that mamby-pamby stuff, that can be left to other people because they're not real scientists like us. And there's one of my former students, embarrassingly, Jeremy Mayhew, in the room. Apparently I taught him at Balliol about half a century ago. And probably I didn't tell him much about data on feelings then. But anyway, that was, if you've done economics, even modern economics, that's still being taught. You do not look at human feelings, even though I assume it's the case, though occasionally it was hard to know that Oxford economists also have feelings. And they must know feelings are the single most important thing in life. I think that was a terrible mistake. Nancy knows about all this kind of background. It seems to me it would be valuable and has become valuable to measure data on falling behind notions, feelings of resentment. A lot of this is, if you're young, is bewilderingly new. You might take it as quite sensible, but it's bewilderingly new by a lot of standards. And we need to act on what we discover. Especially in the USA. Of course, Trump had a sense of this without probably knowing too much about graphs and data and regression equations. But we haven't been paying attention as scientific researchers, not until very recently, and that's been dangerous. I think we're very fortunate to live in the UK, but even we have to be careful. I'd like to remind you, if I may, just before I stop, that when I went and lived in New Jersey, America was astounding. It was like the movies to show up in JFK Airport, just absolutely astounding to me as a young Englishman. we would never have conceived in 1983 the notion that the Capitol Hill would be stormed in basically an insurrection. It wouldn't just have been wildly implausible, it would have just been ridiculous as a notion. That was only a few decades ago. So, you know, we have to be careful to nurture our own democracy because it's amazing how things can change. You may know that Thomas Carlyle in the 1850s described economics as the dismal science. And I'm so sorry, ladies and gentlemen, to have been exceptionally dismal tonight. Thank you for coming.
I think we're proving the point that misery and anger and those negative emotions are kind of more salient and the ones that we focus on a bit more. Because often people say to me that the word well-being and happiness is a bit too fluffy for the serious issues that they care about. And actually, we've got an economic crisis on our hands. Why do we need this happiness and well-being measurement to do with it? But we do have something like 500,000 people in the UK at any one time who score 0 to 4 on all of our subjective wellbeing measures. So that's feeling that their life is worthwhile, that they have feeling what they do is that they're satisfied with their life, that they're happy, and they have high anxiety. It's 500,000 people in the UK, and this is the target of Mission 8 in Levelling Up, which is one way to see it in policy making. So my question here is, have you seen over this period of at least 20, 30 years, an increase in the use of wellbeing evidence in both policy making and in economics? I know the statisticians have been amazing on this.
Well, of course, I've seen what's really a transformation. A few of us, just 2 miles from here, I suppose, at the London School of Economics then, a small number of us started to look at what we called happiness equations, and I suppose they're still called happiness equations. I thought that this was a really good idea and nothing would show up in the public arena until after I was dead. So it's been astounding, quite honestly. I thought common sense would eventually set in, but I didn't expect to see it. Now, we know David Cameron played an important role. Tony Blair, I think, was sympathetic before. The so-called 4 ONS questions, you know them exceptionally well: life satisfaction, anxiety, and so on. Gus O'Donnell, I suspect, played a pivotal role. I don't know, he's never told me in absolute detail. Yeah, that's really changed thinking. Now, it's going to take decades and decades before this becomes the top story on the BBC News. But I think that if you're in your 20s or 30s in this room, yeah, you'll eventually see those numbers, not GDP numbers, as the top, you could call it economic statistic, the top country statistic on the BBC News. That would have seemed impossible 30 years ago. And of course, it doesn't sound wildly plausible to a lot of people now, but that I'm telling you, that is my prediction, because it's just commonsensical to measure human feelings in a systematic way, because feelings are really all that matter. So you know a lot of the answer to your excellent question. A great deal of this has come through.
That's great to hear. And I think actually we see a lot of different variation. We measured wellbeing inequality across the UK. We saw that there were regional variations across that, and that obviously jobs and income, very low income, was part of that, but also people's perception of government, understandably, and life expectancy was much lower as well, the big gaps in life expectancy. And we've seen similar trends picked up by people like Fiona Hill, thinking about the US, the north of England and Russia, and seeing comparisons of that, of the implications for national security. We've also seen a downgrade in our credit rating as a nation on the basis of governance concerns about sort of what I would call institutional social capital. Could we measure wellbeing inequality in the same way as we measure income inequality? Do you see that happening in the future, and is that useful?
Well, certainly we can at some scientific level. I mean, there are papers, plenty of papers out there calculating well-being inequality. So looking at the difference in happiness level, for example, between one region and another. Now, from a mathematical or statistical point of view, actually, that's a lot more complicated than it sounds. especially difficult to do that on inequality of well-being, because feelings are not measured on a true natural scale. Let me leave it like that. But the idea of looking at the dispersion is surely very sensible. Right? We'd like to know how much people enjoy their lives in different parts.
So we can't probably get to like a Gini coefficient equivalent, but we could probably have a go at looking at these comparisons.
People have calculated Gini coefficients. I think this is the wrong moment for me to talk about the difficulties. Gini coefficients rest on cardinal measures. I'll just leave it at that. And these are not cardinal scales. So it's much more difficult to measure inequality, possibly than most researchers think, and certainly more difficult intellectually to do it properly than to measure what's happening to the level.
I think it's really noticeable that a couple of places in the US that have had riots in the last 5-10 years are places that were previously some of the happiest places in America. So I think there are some really interesting trends that we'll start to see play out. I think I've taken a lot of the questions initially. Should we go to the floor? I know we've got questions online. I've seen them pop up as we go, but we'll go to the floor first. Has anybody got some questions that they want to ask Andrew or myself or Bobby? I'm going to go here, and then I've got one at the back and one at the front. I think we'll take... Excuse me.
Thank you. Is there a post-Second World War factor in this? I mean, in that, you know, in times of real stress, people do come together. And I suspect if you measured Ukraine now, you'd probably find that their faith in politicians was much higher than it was 10 years ago. And is this sort of almost like we're too peaceful? The society is turning in on itself because it doesn't have these external threats?
I've seen your work on the 1950s. Go for it.
I mean, that sounds extremely sensible to me. That sounds like very good intuition. I can't tell you real scientific evidence for that. There might be some in the literature, but I can't tell you that. And I like to try and be clear to audiences about when I'm telling you something with real statistical support and when I'm telling you Andrew's instinct. But so I've made that clear, I hope. But yes, my instinct is there must be a lot of truth to that. If your country is in a major crisis, it's been through years of major crisis, it probably reminds you that you need talented, dedicated people with judgment at the top. Some critics of Mr. Johnson and others do not believe that he fits that description. And you might argue that, and I heard this, I've heard this for many years until recently, that, all politicians are the same. There's nothing to worry about. There'll never be a land war in Europe. The nuclear bomb will never be set off. It's all pretty cushy. And if you believe that, then perhaps you might appoint politicians who are amusing, right? Rather than politicians who will lead you through a pandemic and might know about graphs. No doubt was it yesterday or today, Mr. Vance's comments and so on. I can't judge that, but he made that graph. So yeah, that sounds very sensible. If you have too many decades where everything is cushy, why elect somebody who's really principled and sensible? But that's just my instinct. I have no real scientific evidence.
So there is some evidence that under pressure, trust goes higher under nations, and it doesn't always stay there. But our ability to make decisions quickly is what democracy is kind of all about. And that's what that trust is about. And what we saw in organisations and in lots of nations is that those that had a plan and adjusted that plan were able to sustain that trust, so that somebody had been thinking about me and that I was cared about. And that's what authentic leadership was in organisations that were resilient, more resilient during the pandemic. So I think there's lots of research that clearly we could pull together on this topic. I think Building Resilient Britain, that Government Office for Science were leading, started to try and do that, I think. So there's areas of research interest on that topic, if you're keen on that. We go here and then we'll go to the back.
So Andrew, you mentioned that happiness indexes would be shown on BBC in years to come. That's great, but is there not evidence that people don't watch the BBC news anymore? I working on the assumption that the BBC presents news that they've actually researched, which they believe to be based on facts, and they're doing their best to pay the truth, to tell the truth. But so many people these days get their facts from other places. And would it be worth measuring all the various social media outlets where untruths are made that people then accept the new truth? And that is what's feeding some of this misinformation and sparking the distrust and misery in society.
Yeah, that touches on a lot of important areas, doesn't it? But I simply mentioned the BBC as one example. I don't see why lots of media outlets wouldn't become more and more interested in, let's call them happiness data if you want, or whatever, mental well-being scores. We see that all over the world. The World Happiness Report, so-called, I'm not anything to do with it per se, sparks a great deal of interest, gets reported in countries across the globe. Countries don't like being low down on that kind of index. So that will have effects. That's my view.
So I don't think the media have got the hang of reporting this. They often call it happiness. They don't quite get to grips with the communication of it. And I think studying the communication of this type of information would be really useful. I think there is also something about trust in our other institutions, and the UK is now measuring sort of satisfaction with different types of institutions as part of its national wellbeing framework. So I think there's some potential here to really understand where people get that news and where it can be trusted as well. I've got a question at the back, and then we'll go here and then go online. I think we've got a couple online, and we'll come back to the floor after that. One online, then we'll come back to the floor.
Thanks, Andrew. Great talk. It's the second time I've heard it. It was even better the second time. So my question is, the talk was about democracy, which I guess crudely is about like voting and empowering people to take charge of things. What does wellbeing science have to say, or what does the wellbeing research community have to say about how we can improve democracy, or how we can promote democratic renewal with respect to some of the findings you showed?
Yes, that seems very important, a very good question. The first order thing to report, you probably know it, Mark, is that the small liberal democracies, particularly the West European democracies, are the happiest countries in the world on nearly all measures. So that's rather consistent with the importance of democracy, the psychological value of democracy. Of course, it's not clinching to a statistician, but it's certainly a fact worth knowing. Beyond that, there are a bunch of papers, bunch of published papers. I don't think, I suppose I might have a hand in one or two, but generally, I'm afraid I'm sorry to tell you, it's not my work, though I think it's excellent, about different features of a democracy, different features of a society that seem to go along with and may well cause, in a scientific sense, positive well-being effects. Different kinds of voting schemes have been studied, for example, in the cantons of Switzerland, which makes a rather nice laboratory experiment because they use referenda a great deal and so on. I suppose this is not the moment to try and describe details, but democracies tend to be the happiest countries. And yes, a lot of researchers have worked on the features that seem effective.
This reminds me of doing the review of electoral systems, which has given me slight fear. Should we take two more in the room, or do you want to take the one online next? One online next, then we'll come here and then...
Okay. The one online is, Dr. Oswald, don't you think the mistrust in the US comes from disastrous economic policies, reduction of fossil fuels, and politicians out for themselves instead of helping the American public?
So, yes, do we think distrust in politicians has come from how they've managed the economy and fossil fuels? Is that generally paraphrased?
Distress in the country or distress among the leaders?
It says mistrust in the US, so I guess mistrust in politicians.
Trust in politicians.
Yeah, I would have thought that people probably have a pretty good idea of what politicians are doing. So if there's mistrust, my presumption would be that it's sensibly placed, don't you think? Now, no doubt there's a kind of feedback process from politicians to mistrust and from mistrust back onto politicians' behaviour and so on. But I would be surprised if it were irrational thoughts by human beings thinking that they are mistrustful of politicians. It's probably based on observation of what those leaders actually do. I'm hoping that's the sensible answer.
Thank you. We've got one question here and there, and I think that might be it from the floor. But if you've got something burning, we'll come to the front as well. Just here.
It's a fascinating thing, this box. I've never seen anything like it.
I love the box.
It doesn't even sound like a microphone, to me anyway. What about you? It's almost like it's a joke, right? Somebody's filming us. They're going to show it on social media tomorrow.
So I guess it's kind of linked to the first two questions on kind of the rise of social media and the feeling of kind of uniting people. Is there much research on, I guess, how as a society, I mean, I don't have evidence of this, but in terms of intuition, how as a society we've become more isolated just in ourselves. So we don't have as many, it doesn't feel like the communities are as there as maybe they were before. And a lot more things are kind of online and there's a lot more isolation. So is there kind of some research being done on how that is impacting feelings? Because I guess if you're more isolated, then you're less likely to have a community and that might impact your perception of life and that impacts democracy, I guess.
Yes, we touched on different aspects there, but it seems like a very important line of questioning. And I don't know whether you know, there's a huge amount of evidence that friendship groupings, social contacts, these are, in my jargon, they show up with huge coefficients in happiness equations. I'm cursed by thinking in that way. In other words, they're very important to human beings. Now, possibly the average person in the street might say, why on earth would you need equations to discover that? Human beings are very profoundly affected by their social context, but in principle, we can measure the size of the effect compared to being richer or having a happy marriage or being ill and so on. There's a very rich but slightly chaotic debate at the moment about what social media and the modern electronic world and all of that stuff is doing to us. We've got distinguished people lining up on both sides. I would say that at the moment, the balance of the evidence is that there are deleterious effects, bad effects from a lot of social media things. I'm being looser than I would be allowed to in a journal. But I don't think that is a settled matter. And I wouldn't be surprised if different groups have different experiences from social media and different aspects of life might have positives or negatives through social media and email and all the rest that has changed my life. Years ago, when Jeremy and I knew each other, he pointed out that I had more hair then. I thought that was really hitting a bit low, you know. I was about 25 or something, I suppose, and he was a little bit longer. He may remember we had this fantastic staircase and my office was at the top and I saw these students occasionally. So I used to go in at sort of 9 o'clock in the morning. You won't necessarily know this. And I left at 5:30 p.m. at night and nothing happened, right? There were no telephone calls. There was no computer. Of course, there were no phones, no emails or anything. Occasionally, students showed up annoyingly, but at least it paid. At least it paid the bills. But what I'm trying to convey is looking back, the incredible tranquility of being an academic in that era. I don't know, is life better? I've got children in their 40s, my 2 daughters, one's a senior civil servant. Are their lives better because all the stuff? It's very hard to know.
Very pleased there's a reference to loneliness. We've got the campaign to end loneliness in the Works Centre for Wellbeing. I'm going to go for one question here, or Bobby, did you want to follow that one up straight away? So one last question there, and then we'll come to the front for you guys.
Thank you for the talk. I don't have a background in economics or social sciences, so forgive me if this is a silly question. With aspects like inequality and changes in mood correlating to changes in salary, how much is there just an axiom that I don't know about in terms of the economic model in relation to democracy? Or is it just there's so much overlap with the current, say, let's just call it Western, the capitalism, into that evolution of democracy?
Yes, forgive me. I don't entirely understand what exact question you want me to answer. Just let me say one thing and then maybe elaborate. I'm sorry if I'm not picking it up. Income matters to people, and certainly some people worry about income inequality in their countries. So we have good evidence for those things. Now, obviously, economic things overlap in society with lots of other things, and they all mold human happiness. But I didn't quite know whether you had in mind a particular question beyond that sort of stuff.
Well, in terms of well-being and sort of categorizing that as some sort of analysis method, I guess, are there any potential policy changes to the status quo economic model, sort of a much larger set of policy changes that could alleviate the sort of problems that the trends that you've been showing tonight?
Right. Well, certainly plenty of standard ways of thinking by economists have some relation to this. All kinds of economists think about, and some of them worry about, inequality and so on. What would be distinctive about some of the data we've talked about tonight, or what you might call loosely the happiness literature or the mental well-being literature? What's distinctive about that is that that literature focuses very much on trying to measure feelings, right, in what you might think is a commonsensical way, or a tradition that's much longer in psychology as a discipline, I should say. Whereas the tradition in economics is not to do that, but rather to study human actions and to, as it were, impute back to what those actions must have meant in terms of feelings. That's not a word that ever crops up in an economics book, but you get the idea. So you may never have heard of a man called Paul Samuelson, who won the Nobel Prize, an American who wrote the most famous textbook in economics of the last 100 years. And he explicitly said, we can't trust what people say. I'm not quite sure why he thought that, or that was not a scientific judgment, right? We can't trust what people say. So what you should do is measure what they do and then work out, usually with mathematics, what their preferences and cares in life were in work, in life, about work and different aspects of their life. So the tradition I grew up on, and I taught to students probably, was don't be direct, be remarkably indirect. And looking back, that was a rather foolish thing to think, quite honestly. In my opinion, most economists would not agree with me. 80% of economists in the world, at least, maybe 90, would not agree with what I'm telling you. But that doesn't make them right.
I think we can, I think we're at our time, so I might come to our hosts to ask the final two questions. Have we got time for one more question from the floor, or shall we? Yeah.
I came in late, forgive me, but so I might have missed something. What worries me is in a couple of years' time, unemployment is going to start rocketing high, I think. And you're looking at probably in sort of 10 to 15 years' time, something like 10 million unemployed in the UK. Now, the reason for that is AI obviously coming in. And I think if you listen to what Elon Musk said, yeah, where you can work if you want to, what you've got to remember is those that aren't working are effectively unemployed. They're not going to be working, but they're going to have to somehow be supported or find some way of getting food, heating, everything like that. Now, those where he said you could work if you want to, I think it's going to be, what he meant was unpaid work. What he meant was doing charitable type work and not getting a salary. So, you know, that's only starting in a couple of years' time, unemployment that's going to be coming from AI. So what are we going to do to get ready for that? And what's the impact of that on things like solving our problems?
Well, you ask a very lucid question. I'm afraid I don't think it's at all likely that unemployment will be higher 20 years from now, 50 years from now, than it is in the present day. If you look at data over the last 200 years in the UK, you draw a trend through the data, it's entirely flat. We have seen life-changing inventions, really remarkable inventions over the 200 years. And people have, it's a very intuitive thing to think. They've predicted there will be rising unemployment. I'm afraid Mr. Musk has no qualification in economics. And although he's clearly some kind of high IQ man, I never met him, I'm afraid almost every economist in the world would say his views are quite wrong. Just look at the data. I know it's an easy mistake to make, and AI will certainly change the nature of jobs. 100 years ago, you would never have believed there would be personal fitness trainers and chiropractors and all sorts of stuff. But it's essential that I try to convey to this audience, there's no reason whatsoever to believe that unemployment will be higher in the long run in the future, right? We've been through this for hundreds of years.
There is a big difference with AI and other kind of technologies in that AI's goal, its goal is 0% employment or 100% unemployment. That's its goal. The other technologies you're talking about have not had that as their goal.
I'm afraid, forgive me, sir, we can talk about it afterwards. I'm afraid I've got to tell the audience that's quite wrong. Of course, all mechanization, right? You remember the term the Luddite and so on. All mechanization, you might say, I wouldn't use these words, has the goal of putting humans out of work. But what happens is that people get richer and then they want personal trainers and they want all sorts of stuff so that employment switches into different sectors. AI, like all important inventions, will alter the makeup of the kinds of jobs, but it will not, on the basis of evidence of the last 200 years, alter the underlying unemployment rate. You can disagree with that if you want, but I'm just telling you, every economist with a PhD in the world would say the same and point you to 200 years of evidence. So come back to me in 200 years.
I think managing this transition might be one where we might want to watch the wobbles of emotion. Thank you very much for my go, but I think we've got two more questions from the front here before we close off. I think, go for it. I think the hosts can definitely do that.
Andrew, you showed us a salutary reminder by flashing up a picture of Putin that we're lucky in this country. But I did wonder whether the very dramatic fall in trust in politicians might reduce our appetite for defending democracy, not just at home, but overseas. And there's a lot to talk about, we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. I just wondered how solid you think that might be, if you've got any indications.
Well, I think that carries a lot of good intuition, even if one is worried about it. I ran a dinner party for a bunch of friends last week, and you can imagine they're a bit like me, really, because homophily, the desire to talk to people like yourselves, is rather strong in all humans. So if you make an assessment of me, you can imagine there's a whole lot of people like that around the table. And one of my friends said, maybe we should think about the benefits of autocracy. And, that produced a lively discussion from all these PhDs and bloody liberals and eco-warriors and all the other folk who are my close friends. I put up a slide. You wouldn't have been able to see that only 8% of the world's citizens live in a full democracy. So, I think there's going to be tremendous attacks, and some kind of autocracy has a good chance of taking over, especially in the USA. Nancy?
I like to connect it. I think prosperity, freedom, democracy are all quite associated with the idea of autonomy, which is a strong driver of well-being, both at an individual level, our autonomy and feeling like we could choose what we do in life, but also at a national level as well, and also that local and civic leadership that we're relying on to boost our prosperity in the UK as we grow that across the regions, which is, I think, mission 12 of Levelling Up, I think is really important. But you need that civic leadership across all sectors for that to happen, and you do need everyone to play their part. And I think one of the things that's happened on social media is that we found people like ourselves more and more, and therefore it's much easier to find that in other groups. You've then got massive status anxiety happening, and also you're not necessarily doing the shared things with other people, which is why I think one of the things that's really quite important is that we all go to vote in person together, and that it's a little bit of an effort to do so, because that's a shared thing that we all do regardless. We don't choose who else goes to do that. So I think that's quite an important feature and ritual of democracy that's worth defending and keeping. Bobby, last word?
Yeah, great. No, brilliant. And thank you both for an excellent session, both Andrew and Nancy. So I'm a survey researcher by background, so I'd love to hear an economist saying attitudes and feelings are key here. So thank you for that. That's really good. And part of that role is I'm principal investigator for the World Values Survey in the UK, which goes all the way back to 1981, covers 100 different countries, 290 different questions. For the UK, we say there's three messages from that at a very high level, which is that we actually like each other more than the rhetoric around culture wars and how divided we are. We've got more tolerance and more connection between different groups. So we think that's kind of point.
That's for our country.
For our country, for UK. And the second one is that we really do support the principle of democracy. If you ask people what's a good system to run, it's actually increasing that sense. People saying that democracy is a very good system to aspire to, not other types of systems in the UK. But the third one is it's how it's working in the UK, how institutions are delivering for us is the problem. And that has gone down, satisfaction and confidence in lots of different institutions. That's kind of point one. Point two is there are lots of different trajectories around the world in different countries. The smaller Northern European countries, trust in institutions, views of democracy, all get lots of positive trends as well as negative trends. So I suppose my takeaway a bit is that both of those are really important to recognise in the context of getting lots of messages that actually people are sick of what we have and it's time to rip it up and try something else, which is what a lot of autocrats play on, is that sense of everyone is sick of this, it's not working, it's not just how it's delivering, it's the principle, it's the wrong approach, and you all don't like each other, but I can come in and solve this. And it's kind of those two things. So I guess my final thing was, how do we balance that? And do you have a more hopeful path than the miserable one that you laid out so so beautifully for us, Andrew? Is there a hopeful path in there?
There are always hopeful paths in life. And I mean, human beings do have this ability to pull back from disaster. Obviously, I grew up under the shadow of nuclear war. I was a child, my father was very concerned about the Bay of Pigs and the chance that there'd be nuclear war. That's been a threat over and over again, but you know, the truth is that we can sometimes pull back from disaster. So I do have a hope there. If you remember, Biden's midterm elections turned out better than one might have thought. It's going to be awfully close, though. In the USA, I can't see Biden doing it. Personally, the Democrats might get a candidate in time. There is this guy Newsom, who's 6'3", which is a pretty good indicator. Californian of being voted for in the United States. So I am pessimistic, I'm afraid. I've got to be honest. But yeah, throughout human history, we've got a way of pulling back. We thought the Middle East was really going to go up in flames, and I'm afraid it still might. But in fact, although it's awful in the locality, it hasn't turned out to be a full pitch war. Maybe I'm clutching at straws here. This is not, you know, I'm not saying it's a great scenario, but yeah, there's definitely a chance. Yes, sure.
So I'm hopeful because from 2010 to 2019, we did move the dial on some of these measures. We lost that progress during the pandemic, but it is possible to change subjective wellbeing measures, and we've managed to do it in a number of parts of the country. So that's what gives me hope.
Right. That's a bit cheeky asking a question. We need to close now. So huge thanks to Andrew and Nancy for a really, really stimulating discussion. And thank you to you all for attending. You don't have to go home yet. There are drinks available. The next Better Evidence event in our series will be taking place in February. So we'll be emailing out details to sign up, and also please do spread the word to other friends and colleagues who you think might be interested. Do stay and join us for a drink, and let us thank our panelists in the traditional way.